Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Haygood, and I'm a PhD student at Oklahoma State University, and I'm going to be talking about Engaging Oklahoma, Bridging the Science Policy Gap, which will just cover a few public policy initiatives that I employed in Oklahoma over the past year, and talk about implementing those and the results, and then talk about conclusions and future work of doing this. And so this is just an overview of my presentation. And so first of all, we can talk about the background in Oklahoma politics. We can talk about a bridge to build and kind of why we're focusing on doing these public policy initiatives. And then that's going to bring us into the goal of kind of the outcome of what we're trying to get in Oklahoma. And then talking about Oklahoma water quality and method number one, which I've called community science, and then a few additional methods of public policy initiatives, and then talking about conclusions, which will also then lead into future work of things that we might try and consider doing in the following year. So just to talk about the background in Oklahoma politics, there are about 5 congressional districts in the state of Oklahoma as illustrated on the map on the left. And then on the right, I've kept congressional districts outlined in bold, but have also included Republican versus Democrat voter registration as pulled from the Oklahoma State Election Board by county. And so even though we do see differing degrees of voter registration, our state turned completely red in the 2020 presidential election, as shown on the map on the right. And in the 2020 general election, it was a record-setting year for the highest number of Oklahomans to vote using the straight party option. So this meant that about 45% or 710,200 voters voted using the straight ticket option. And of using the straight ticket option, about 200,000 Oklahoma voters, or 28%, were Democrat, and about 510,200, or 72%, were voting Republican. And so the background in Oklahoma politics really leads into the bridge to build, which is kind of the gap that we're focusing on trying to fix using public policy initiatives. So currently there's a gap between policymakers, scientists, and community members, which is illustrated with the figure on the left. And additionally, a study that covered majority of 2020 utilized fact-checking services across Facebook and wound up concluding that about 93% of Republican Oklahoma policymakers at the state level were sharing misinformation, and the remaining 7% were from a few Democrat policymakers at the state level for Oklahoma. And the misinformation primarily focused on scientific studies such as COVID-19, which does not help in restoring faith in the role of science and policy. And so the sharing of misinformation is one cause of this gap between policymakers, community members, and scientists. And then there are additional causes to the gap, some of which that include jargon, so using technical terminology, differences in incentives, differences in expectations, and then differences in politics. And so really this gap between policymakers, community members, and scientists from the bridge to build really leads us into what I'm deeming the goal. And so basically what we want to do is to employ public policy initiatives to bridge the gap between scientists and policymakers, as well as community members. And so essentially by bridging this gap, the hope is to begin to restore faith in the role of science and policy. And so we want to take this figure over here and through public policy initiatives wind up with a situation as illustrated on the right where policymakers, community members, and scientists are all interlinked and working together and restoring the role of faith with science and policy. And so I decided to first try and bridge the gap through community science, primarily focusing on Oklahoma water quality, as I was aware that there were community members who were concerned about Oklahoma water quality and had been for many years now. And so in this GIF, the red areas are designated EPA Category 5 impairments, meaning they are polluted with at least one designated use not being supported or threatened. And so those designated uses could be things like recreation, drinking water, or aquatic life. And no community science project has dealt with metals and water, and that was the main public concern at the time this was started. And additionally, at the time of starting this, Oklahoma lacked funding for extensive water quality analyses of metals, so this project could help fill in data gaps, which would lead to more effective water policy. And so through this GIF, we're seeing the impairments segments of surface water systems change over time in 2-year increments, just because a water quality report comes out every 2 years in Oklahoma. And so using this as background information allowed us to sort of target areas to focus on for metal analyses. And so that brings us into what we call method number 1, community science. So from using the integrated water body reports, we could target segments to do community science at. And so the main goal of doing community science was to empower communities to get involved in water science and policy action. And so that kind of started out with August of 2020 being notified that received a microgrant and then obtained supplies to allow us to do analyses. And then in fall 2020, starting the project. And then in summer of 2021, more than 500 people have been involved, and teachers even incorporated it into their classrooms. And then over here is just one picture of a group of people, and we went and we tested a local wetland in northeast Oklahoma and got some water quality data at that site and talked about what it meant. And so I approached community science in sort of a 3-part segment. And so it involved trainings, and here's a picture from one training, which kind of involved teaching people how to collect surface water samples, as well as discussing the data that we gathered and what it meant in terms of public health and aquatic ecosystem health. And this also included kind of validating the scientific process, because we're collecting samples properly and then going through the proper data testing, wearing the appropriate safety gear, and going through that entire start to finish process. And then additionally, if people were interested, they could take a mini test kit with them, which is shown in the middle picture here, and that would allow them to test water samples of their own interest. And what I found was a lot of people were interested in testing either their local creek or testing their tap water. And then additionally, the project included discussions and information on public policy. And so this way, community members would be empowered to engage with their local or federal policymaker. And then policymakers would also benefit, because we would break down jargon and provide visuals such as maps or illustrations to show why science is needed in the policymaking process. And so that kind of brings us into the additional methods. And so additional methods I found to be successful included ArcGIS story maps. And so pictured on the left is one example. And these were interactive story maps that brought the viewer to the water system and walked them through problems, ways to take action, real stories from real people, and more. And these story maps would not have been successful without community members within Oklahoma, as well as across the United States, submitting water systems to be featured. And webinars, one example is featured on the right here, also proved to be successful, especially in trying to bridge that gap and restore faith in the role of science and policy. And so an example of that is that local environmental organizations and or state agencies would be invited to share their work and how their scientific studies were being conducted and utilized to develop water-related policies. And so that brings us down to the conclusions. So again, there are a variety of reasons why there remains a public policy gap in Oklahoma. This includes misinformation, such as policymakers sharing scientific misinformation on a social media platform. This includes jargon, this includes differences in incentives, this includes differences in expectations, and this also includes differences in politics. And through the past year, I identified 2 successful methods of working to bridge the public policy gap in Oklahoma, which include community science and then what I deemed interactive visuals and gatherings, which would be things such as webinars and ArcGIS story maps. And then additionally, I found that a key factor in doing all this was building trust with community members and policymakers. And I found this was a really key and important step toward working towards bridging this public policy gap in Oklahoma. And so, following the conclusions, there is future work that can be done. And since this has been going on for 1 year, we're just getting started. And so there's still more work to do to address things of misinformation, jargon, incentives, expectations, and politics. And there's future work in continuing to engage with Oklahoma with public policy initiatives, because we're forming these relationships and working towards bridging this gap. And so there's more we can do with community science, as well as more we can do with utilizing interactive visuals and gatherings just to bring people to specific locations to sort of further public policy work. And so just want to finish off by saying that you can bridge the public policy gap too. There are resources by AGU as well as by other science organizations that can help you get started in science policy and help you work towards bridging that public policy gap in your local community or within your state. And small actions can cause big ripples, so no matter what action you choose to take, you can make a difference and help bridge the public policy gap in your location too. And so there are a lot of people and organizations that I'd like to thank and acknowledge. I would like to acknowledge AGU Voices for Science. Their support and mentoring while a Voices for Science advocate was immensely helpful, and their microgrant enabled me to start a community science project. And additionally, I would like to thank the Soil and Water Conservation Society for their help and mentorship as well. And I would also like to thank my professors, both from the University of Tulsa, where I earned my bachelor's and master's, as well as at Oklahoma State University, where I'm in my first semester of my PhD program. And I would also like to acknowledge Oklahoma community members, policymakers, and environmental organizations. And then thank you for listening and watching to my talk. My contact information is listed, as well as my social medias, if you would like to reach out with any questions or comments. And I look forward to seeing you all in New Orleans for the fall meeting. Thank you.